consider the superheroes of the comics like I grew up with, you quickly learn that their strength is best seen when it comes up against the most incredibly devious, strong villain. Think of it this way. Think about this. Would we ever truly know how powerful Superman was if the only thing he ever did was get kittens out of trees? Seriously. Would we ever know the incredible intellect, the detective skills of Batman if the only thing he ever did was solve jaywalking cases? No. We know their power because Superman goes up against people like Lex Luthor and Batman goes up against the Joker. Superheroes are best understood. Their powers are best seen when they go up against forces that are beyond the limitations of humans to handle or to solve. I have a theory that this is the reason that we don't fully appreciate the grandeur or the power of God's grace, because we so often only consider it against the trivial. The approval of a loan will come through. A job opens up for us. We pass a final exam that we didn't really study for, and we will say things like, man, God's grace in my life. Maybe. But the truth is that none of those things were beyond human limitations to achieve, and God may have been in it. But when we only talk about God's grace in terms of the small stuff, we miss the power of God's grace because we don't put it against the real issues of life. What about the pain and suffering of human existence? What about the dreaded reality of sin that tempts us and entices us to make decisions that ruin our marriages and our family and our finances? What about situations where other people, not us, where other people make terrible decisions and we're caught up in the hurricane of their consequences? This is where human limitations are. These are the kinds of circumstances where human limitations are at their end to have any kind of a solution for these things. And these are the places where we ultimately wish that we could know of powers that would help us to escape the gravity of the situation and fly away, or give us power to endure those nights of depression, or to give us that incredibly super vision to be able to see through those circumstances and know that everything will turn out okay. I'm going to suggest to you that the scriptures actually speak of God's grace as being more than sufficient to handle the worst that life can throw at us. That the scriptures have a significantly deeper approach to God's grace than we ultimately attribute to him. Specifically, we're going to, over the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at 4 terms that the Bible uses to speak about the scope, the grandeur, the amazing, like we just sung, the amazing nature of his grace. 4 key terms that the Bible speaks about. We're going to look at how God acts on his foreknowledge, how God exercises his forbearance or his patience, about how God is unwilling to forget any of us, and how God is completely willing to forgive us. 4 terms that all start with the letters F-O-R, and that's the reason we're calling this series The Fantastic Four. 4 words that all start with 4. But more than that, we want to make an illustration from the comics, specifically from the Fantastic Four. Now, I know that they're not everybody's favorite superhero. Just pausing, because I actually had in the first one someone to go, hey, like I really stepped on their toes. The Fantastic Four were who they loved the most. So if that's your thing, that's great. But the Fantastic Four were a team that were crafted in 1961 in the American comics, ultimately would become the Marvel comics, and it was a team of 4 superheroes: Mr. Fantastic, Invisible Woman, Human Torch, and Thing. And what was key was this, that while other superheroes were individuals, Superman, Spider-Man, Thor, the Fantastic Four, they worked as a team. They each had their own unique trait, their own unique superpower, but whenever they would come up against the strongest of villains, they always worked together, and it was the combination of those traits that really showed the immenseness of their power. And I'm going to argue that when we look at these 4 terms in the scriptures, foreknowledge, forbearance, his never forgetting us, his always forgiving us, we will get a much bigger understanding of why we call God's grace amazing, that when combined together, we will see an incredible picture of how great our God is. Today, we're just starting with foreknowledge, that God acts on his foreknowledge. Look with me at a passage in Romans. Paul, in Romans chapter 8, says this, starting in verse 26. Paul says, "In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how we should pray, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with inexpressible groanings. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes on behalf of the saints, according to God's will. And we know that all things work together for good, for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose, because those whom he foreknew," there's our word, "he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that his Son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those who he predestined, he called. Those he called, he justified. Those he justified, he glorified." I'm going to do something this morning that I don't usually do when it comes to preaching or teaching. I'm going to start in the middle of the passage. This is like taking an Oreo apart and licking the cream first. We're starting in the middle of the passage. And the reason I'm doing that is that in verse 29, Paul says this in the middle of the paragraph. He says, "because those whom he foreknow." In other words, Paul sets a foundational statement right in the middle of the paragraph that it becomes the foundation for everything he's going to say. The truth is that single verse is actually the foundation for the entirety of chapter 8. But we're going to just focus on this one paragraph today where Paul says, "because those whom he foreknew." What does that mean? What does it mean that God foreknew us? Because that's the foundational truth. Now, there are tons of denominations that have approaches to these kinds of things, but this morning, and I'm just focusing on Romans 8 this morning, so I'm not making any large conclusions about predestination, those kinds of things. We're just looking at Romans 8, and I'm going to argue this morning that in Romans 8, Paul's use of the Greek word here, prognosko, is not talking about God's intellectual capacity to know us before creation. Yes, Ephesians speaks to that. Yes, there are other passages that speak to that. But here in Romans 8, Paul is specifically using the word where he is pulling from a Hebrew mindset or understanding, the Hebrew word that he's going to be kind of echoing in through the Greek use of his writing here, the Hebrew word "gada," meaning to know. That's a relational term. It's not an intellectual one. It doesn't mean to know something intellectually the way that we would know that 2 + 2 is 4. Yada, the Hebrew term, know, is a relational one. It's the reason that people can make jokes about married couples knowing each other in a biblical way. And yes, you can laugh. It's a joke. Not a single person. The first service loved that joke. Loosen up, guys. It's Father's Day. But that word actually is used in that sense. Yada, the Hebrew, talking about how a man will know his wife because of the depth of the intimacy. But it's not just used that way. It's used other ways to speak about the depth of relationship. Look at what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 10. And you should appreciate this because we just came through this series on Moses. It says in Deuteronomy 34, "No prophet ever again arose in Israel like Moses, who knew the Lord." How did he know him? Face to face. Relationally, depth. He didn't just know about God. He didn't just know things of God. He didn't just know stories. He knew God. Notice what it says in Hosea 13:5. God speaking through the prophet Hosea. He says this about his people in the wilderness. God says, "I knew you in the wilderness." The Hebrew again, yada, the King James gets it literally right. The King James translates exactly as it's written in the Hebrew. "I knew you in the wilderness." Other translations, though, that want to get the depth of the relational aspect, and they translate it correctly, even though they change the translation of the English, things like the NET will say, "I cared for you in the wilderness." And that's correct, because the word here, know, is not intellectual. It's not, "I knew you were there." It's, "I cared for you. I loved you. I knew you." We understand this. We use the word the exact same way. Maybe a person invites you to go to a restaurant where you know that reservations are just impossible to come by. Maybe they invite you to a concert, or maybe they invite you to something, like an event like the OC Air Show or whatever, and you're like, "I never got tickets for that thing." And they'll say, "Don't worry about it. I know the owner." You get what they're talking about, right? You don't think that they mean that they just know that person's name. You don't think that they just know that that's who that person is because they read their name in an article somewhere. You're assuming that they have a relationship with that person, that when they say, I know the owner, they're suggesting to you that on the basis of the relationship, there are benefits that they can expect to know someone. And that is how Paul uses the word here in Romans 8. He says that from the moment that you entered into relationship with God, he knew you. He knew you. That's why the song says, from the moment of the beginning of that relationship. But Paul uses the word foreknew, not just that he knew or knows. He says he foreknew. What does that mean? Paul will make the point in Romans 8 that the moment you said yes to Jesus, the moment you understood the invitation from God to surrender your life to him, that at that moment, God knew exactly who he was going to make you into, who he was going to craft you to be, how he was going to ultimately get you to heaven. Paul actually maps it out in that actual verse. He says it's not just that he foreknew us, it's that he predestined, he called, he justified, he glorified. He knows the entire process. And here's the key thing. Paul will make the case that the reason God knows at that moment who he is going to make you to be is because it will be his grace that will do it and not anything that you will do. Catch that. It will be his grace that will do this in your life. In any other relationship in the world, whether we're entering into a financial relationship with someone, whatever the case will be, people usually look for us to put up some form of inequity. We say we're going to do something, they'll say, well, let's see how this relationship goes a little bit, or let's kind of go down the road a little. But God, at the very moment that you said yes, he did not wait for you to kind of walk it out for a couple of weeks. God did not say, well, look, I tell you what, why don't you just kind of obey me for about a month. Let's see how this goes, and once I see you're really into it, then we'll talk about my plans. No, it says at the beginning, he foreknew exactly who we were going to be, how he was going to predestine us, how he was going to shape us and conform us into the image of his son. Why? Because it would be his grace that will do it, not anything that we do. His power in our life. How? How does he do that? What are the powers? How is he the superhero that comes into our life that does this for us? I'll suggest to you this, that Paul will describe in this passage of Romans 3 ways that he applies his grace on the basis of his foreknowledge, his knowing who we're supposed to be. Here's the first one. He sets our course. He sets our course. Look back at the passage again. It says, because those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. I don't intend for this to be a theological lesson this morning. My apologies for the use of the original language, but I need you to hear Paul's heart behind the words, because sometimes these kinds of terms get lost into dry discussions about predestination or foreknowledge. But the word here that he uses for predestination, proorisen, just simply literally means to decide beforehand. To decide beforehand. I think you can kind of map people into 2 large categories. I think you can map the entirety of our world's population into 2 categories. Those that plan their vacation and those that do not. I'm in the latter. It'll be early August and my wife will say, so are we going anywhere this year? Are we doing it? Yes, we are. Where? I don't know. But we're doing something, as opposed to others who have the beach house or the park or the hotel rented 2 years in advance. You know the restaurant you're going to, you know where you're going to eat, you know what it's going to cost, you have the discount tickets, you've got everything on your phone saved in folders with the passes to scan at the moment that you're going to get there, where you're going to park, when you're going to get there, what you're going to do if it rains. You have everything decided. If I could tell you the number of people right now, I see hands doing this, pointing to people, you get it. That's what it means to decide beforehand. In the context, Paul says this, that the moment you said yes to him, God instantly mapped out how he was going to shape you into the likeness of his son. That God instantly mapped how he was going to lead you to glorification. lead you to your eternal reward. He knew every single step he was going to take in your life. He knew everything he was going to do. He knew who you were going to become. You can't even see it yet, but he knows it. He foreknows. He sets the course. Think about that for a second. Because what that means is that when you said yes to Jesus, you were not just left to your own choices. You were not just left to figure it out. It wasn't just a do the best you can, pray as hard as you might. Instead, an entire mapping of the course was set before you that God knew. The best illustration I can think of is how I schooled my son this year. When COVID hit about 15 months ago, like everybody, our son's school went instantly into online education. And no disrespect to the teachers whatsoever. I want to say that clearly. They were rock stars. But we learned a couple of weeks into the thing that his teachers were figuring out the online way to educate at the same time that he was. And for our son, it was just a slow process where we just felt like, it was. So we said, you know what? We don't know how long this COVID thing is going to last. Let's do this. Let's withdraw him out of that school. Let's put him into an actual homeschooling environment that has this online format down, that has been doing it for years, that knows how this, and so we enrolled him in a homeschooling system that was an online environment that has been doing this for years and years and years and years and years. And here's what was the cool thing about it was that he would log in, and every day that he logs in, he sees what is expected of him that day. But the future days, the modules for other days, they're all locked, and the only way you can unlock the future days is to complete the day that you're on. But they had a parental access that I got. And the parental access allowed me to see the entire year. I could log into any day, any class, any course, any test, any video, any project. I was given the ability to see everything. And so what I would do every single week for him is late Sunday night or extremely early Monday morning, I would get up and I would look at the entirety of the week. Before he had even gotten out of bed, I would look at the entirety of the week. I would look at the test that he had coming up. I would physically go into the test and look at the questions. I would look at the reviews that the teachers were putting out there. I would look at the content of the videos. I would see what the projects would entail. Was there any materials that we were going to have to buy? Were we going to have to do this and do that? Were we going to have to go anywhere? I looked at every single detail, and then every single morning I got up and I mapped him a schedule, and I said, this is what you have to complete this day. And there were some days that I gave him way more than what the online thing said to do. And he would say, Dad, the dashboard only says I have to do. I said, I know what I'm doing here. Trust me in this. And there'd be days it'd be 5 o'clock, 5:30, and he'd be like, man, normal school got out at 3:30. And I'd be like, trust me on this. Be Saturday morning, and I'd be like, I want to start this project. It's Saturday. Trust me on this. I was mapping the course because I could see the entirety ahead of it. Paul will say in Romans 8 that God knows those same things for you. He sees the entirety. He knows exactly what you should do every single step of the way. He knows the jobs you should take. He knows the people that you should meet. He knows the places you should go. And conversely, that means by default, he knows the places you should not go, the places you should not move to, the jobs he does not want you to have, the people he does not want you necessarily in relationship with, which means that to follow God on his course can mean pain sometimes, can mean sadness, because our heart goes one way and God goes, that's not the course. It's not the path. And we can know heartbreak. Both my wife and I, prior to meeting each other, were engaged to other people. Both of us allowed our hearts into other relationships before we knew each other, and in both circumstances, we didn't even know each other at the time, but both of us were in previous engagements where our heart was saying, this is good, but we sensed God going, not for you. Both of us had to go through broken engagements, and let me tell you something, that's a nightmare. But it wasn't God's pathway. There was grief, there was sadness, there was pain, there was human just emotion of, oh, God, where are you? God, what are you doing? All the kind of stuff that we all say to God. But he knew. Does Paul account for that? He does. Notice what Paul says in the very same chapter we're looking at, Romans 8, verse 18. Paul says, listen, folks, I consider that our present sufferings are not even worth comparing with the glory that's going to ultimately be revealed. It doesn't matter what you are going through or what you might go through. It's not, you can't even remotely imagine what he has for you. Trust him. Trust him. This past week, my son clicked submit on his last final exam. I sat there with him when he did it. He had it on his very, very last final. And I had his last 2 weeks, man, I had worked that boy. And he pushed submit. And we went, high five, slammed the laptop shut. And I said, and he was like, I'm done. I was like, summer, here we are. You know, we hit summer, like, this is awesome. He was like, I'm free. And the thing is that in his gaming community, and for those of you that don't know what that is, you're blessed. The gaming community is that when he goes upstairs to play his games, he puts his headphone on, he has his online friends of the people that I don't see them physically, but they're clearly in his room by virtue of the volume that's taking place. And some of those go to the same online schooling he does, and on the basis of their schedule, the school schedule, it actually was supposed to go until the early part of July. And he came downstairs and he said, I said, where are your friends? He said, they had to sign off. They have school to do. And I said, and you don't. He's like, I'm free. And I was like, you get it? I was like, remember those nights where I took you to 6 o'clock? Yeah. Remember those weekends where I said, I want you to work on the project now? And you're like, but Dad. I was like, was it worth it? It was worth it. Because he was free. There are pains that on a path where God says, not that way, not this way, this is hard, this. But he knows what he's doing. His grace sets the course. He knows who he wants you to be. He knows how to get you where he wants to put you. Trust him. Here's the second thing Paul's going to allude to. Paul will say, he also provides us counsel. He also provides us counsel. The reason I make this case, I shouldn't say the reason I think Paul makes this case, is because when a person hears that God sets the path, that God creates the steps, that God orders this, there are some people that begin to go, well, wait a second. I mean, does that mean that I just kind of blindly go through life and God's just going to make everything, that he's already determined everything? I mean, are we just robots in the process? I mean, but that's not the case at all. Look at how the prophet Jeremiah referenced this exact same topic in his writings. Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 23, which is one of my life verses that I have just plastered in places that I can always see it in my life. Jeremiah says this, I know, Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself, that it is not man who walks to direct his steps. Jeremiah says two things simultaneously. He says, I know that a man's way is not his. I know that a man's direction is not his to determine. But notice he also says this in his words. He says, it is not in man who walks. We still have to walk. We still have to take the steps. We still have to follow God in the pathway. We still have to go. If God says right, we are the ones that, we still have to be the one to take the step right. If God says no, we have to be the ones that go, okay, I'm not going to. We still have to make human-based decisions. And that can inspire fear in people. What if I make a wrong decision? What if God didn't want me to take this job? What if this isn't God? We get fearful about those things. I have been like that my whole life. I have no problem telling you that this has been one of the areas that I have always struggled with. I had a professor in college who used to tell me, he would say, Lane, you make the faith walk so hard. He said, you make it like a tightrope, scared to death. You're going to take one step, and then God's going to be like, that's it, you're done. My dad used to always say to me, he would say, it's amazing to me that you can have so much knowledge in your head about God's scriptures, but when it comes to walking it, you're so petrified to make a decision. What if I get it wrong? But Paul would say, you don't have to think that way or fear that. Look what he says in the same exact passage. He says this, verse 26, likewise the Spirit helps us in our weakness. Paul says right away, we're weak. We're weak. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought. Do you hear that? Paul is admitting we don't even know how to pray. It's not even enough to say we don't know what the next step is or what the next thing is. Paul says, we don't even know how to pray as we ought. And he says this. He says, so the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings that are too deep even for our own language. And the one, speaking of God, who searches hearts, God knows what is in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God, not according to your pleasures, but according to God's will. He says the Spirit is actively interceding for you. That God gives us the counsel of his Spirit in us to lead us, to guide us, to caution us, to give direction, to give wisdom, to give all kinds of insight, which means that when we go to pray, we don't need to go to say, I need a concrete answer from God. People say this all the time, because I say this. We'll say, I just need God to drop it in my lap. I just need God to say this word. No, Paul would say, no, you just need to seek the Spirit of the Lord and say, guide me. And listen, because he is actively praying for you. He provides counsel. A couple of months ago, a person was going to stop by my house, and I said, let me give you directions. And they said, directions? And I said, yeah. I said, we're past the police barracks, and there's a pond there. And they said, just give me the address. And I went, oh, yeah. We have these things called phones. We don't do directions anymore. We don't say, go past the third tree, turn left at the White House. We don't do that anymore. We just take an address, we put it in the phone, and we put the phone on the dashboard or in the little clip in front of us, and then we just listen to that thing. 500 feet, turn right. 600 feet, turn left. You missed your path. Recalculating it again. Do you know where you're going? I think that's what mine would say to me. But we just listen to the directions. We just let that thing guide us. Why? Because it is looking at the maps. It knows the entirety of the map. It knows all the directions, the paths, the turns. It knows everything. The scriptures will tell us that the Spirit of God leads us and guides us like this. No, hold up. Not the one. Need this. This is God. We just listen. God's grace sets the course, and then he gives us the counsel of his Spirit to guide, to lead. His grace is amazing, all on the basis because he knows his foreknowledge. He knows what he wants us to be and how to get us where we're supposed to go. Here's the third and final one. Paul says he arranges our circumstances. He arranges our circumstances. One of the things that we may at times tend to think, and it's a human thought, everybody in this room has thought it, myself included, is that we go, sounds good in a sermon. He sets our course, he provides counsel. But we all know that life is not some two-dimensional flat board like the actual game of life. Anybody know that? Just checking to see. That's always an age check with me. The game of life, the flat board. Spin the wheel, move the car, put the pieces in. College, no college. Never do college in life. The game of life. In real life, I'm completely in support of higher education. In the game of life, don't ever go the route of college. Just go fast. Trust me on this one. And don't have a lot of kids. Again, the game of life, not the real life. We go, it's not like that. We understand that life is significantly more complex. That we could do everything in our power to listen to God. We could do everything in our power to make right decisions. We could do everything in our power to try to go the straight and narrow with God. The problem is that we are in relationships with other people, with spouses, with friends, with family, with coworkers. We drive on the road with other people, and other people make decisions, and other people who are not following God, their decisions and their bad decisions can ultimately impact and detour our life too. The joke is told of the guy who got on the plane and was surprised to see the Pope sitting on the plane. And so he sits down next to him and he hears the Pope praying ardently that God would protect the flight. And when the Pope finishes, the guy turns to him and says, I'm surprised to see how passionately you're in prayer there. I mean, aren't you in good with God? And the Pope responded, I am. I just don't know if the pilot is. That's our life. I'm doing it, but I don't know. Bad things happen that we had no decision in. A spouse becomes unfaithful. A family member falls under addiction. An employer does something shady and our job's threatened. Another driver, not us, another driver decides to drink one night and ultimately hits our car, and we're the ones that are physically impaired, or worse yet, there's the loss of life. But remember what I said earlier? That a superhero's power is best known when it is put up against a real nemesis, not the petty stuff. We have a tendency to put grace against the petty stuff. Oh, I got a bonus this week, God's grace. I'm going to use it to buy a big screen TV. I mean, is that God's grace that we got a big screen TV? It's kind of like Superman rescuing a kitten out of a tree. No, I would dare say that Paul is challenging us here as he's saying, put God's grace against the big stuff. Let's place it against the alarming diagnosis of cancer. Let's place it against that family member that unfortunately took their own life and the result was that you're left with the mortgage and the bills and the loneliness. Let's put it against the teen child that overdoses or the fire that overtakes the house and takes everything. Let's put God's grace against the big stuff and let's see how it measures up, because those are the situations we want the superhero in. And Paul would suggest God's grace can handle it. Look at how he says, here is the last verse we're looking at. Right in the context of the passage we've been in the entire sermon. You know this verse, but maybe you never knew it was in this paragraph. Here's how Paul answers in Romans 8:28. He says, but we know this. On the basis of the knowledge that God knows us, on the basis that God sets our path, on the basis that God provides counsel, we know this, that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. I don't know how he does it, and I won't know how he does it, nor will you. But God has this unique ability through his grace in our life to make everything work for his purposes, even the bad. Even the stuff we have no control over, even the stuff that enters our life because of somebody else's decision. Paul says, all things, he makes them work according to his purposes and his plans, and he sets them in a way that your pathway is in no way detoured. It might look like it to you, not to him. He and he alone arranges the entirety of the circumstances. His sovereignty knows not just the entirety of your pathway, he knows everything that's taking place, and he works and arranges the circumstances so that nothing is outside the spectrum of his sovereignty and his counsel and his guidance. There is no such thing for those who love God, and that's the key thing in the passage. Notice this. It says, for those who love God. There's a misconception in our society that God just generally does this for everybody. He doesn't. In the context of this paragraph, Paul is talking about God's grace for those that he foreknows, for those that are in relationship with him, for those, right here in this verse, for those that love him, he does all this. You say, just for those that love, just for those that love? You say, well, let me show it to you in Jesus' words. Jesus, speaking to his disciples, said this. Matthew records it in chapter 7. Jesus says, look, not everyone who says to me, Lord, is going to ultimately enter eternity. Actually, on that day, Jesus says, a lot are going to come, and they're going to say, Lord, we did so many things. We prophesied. We cast out demons. We did so many powerful deeds. And Jesus is going to say, but I'm going to have to declare to them, I never knew you. I never knew you. Yes, you did tons of stuff. Yes, you thought religion was important. Yes, you were a religious person. Yes, you went to church. But you never said yes to my invitation to surrender to me, so I never knew you. I was not able to set your course. I was not able to provide counsel. I was not able to arrange circumstances because we never entered into relationship. The imperative nature to come and surrender your life to God, not join a church, not come to religion, not just read your Bible, but to actually say yes to Christ, because when you do, His grace becomes amazing. And he sets the course. He provides the counsel. He will even arrange the circumstances. He takes it personally upon himself to ensure you are going to become what he wants you to be and get where he wants you to go. That is his grace. That is his grace. Let me close with this illustration about how powerful God is and how much we need to understand his grace. Let me show you, I always pick on my son as a young thing. Let me pick on myself. Let me take you back to 1975 when I was 4 years old. I'm the guy on this side. Yeah, aren't I cute? It's my brother and I. My brother's on my left, and I'm, as all kids do, looking up to my brother. We had superhero. We were big comic book fans as kids. Superhero, all of it. And we had Superman outfits. And my brother wanted us to get pictures of us flying, so he's like, put your arms out. Now, if you look closely, you'll notice I don't have a cape on. And the reason is because if you look really closely in this blurry 1970s Polaroid, you'll notice that our dog is in the picture, and the dog has my cape. Because my brother convinced me that there was such a thing as Superdog, and we had to have Superdog in the picture. And so, of course, my older brother, who had superhero powers of mind control, manipulated me to take my cape off and put it on the dog. But he's like, let's fly. We're going to be flying. And so here we are in Superman's outfits with our arms outstretched. Let me ask them, why do young kids want to do that? Why do we put our arms out? Why do we want to fly? Why do we want to? Well, let me illustrate it for you this way. One of the cool things about modern cinematography, modern cinema and movies, is that through special effects today, the movie industry can capture the imagination of adults that when we were kids, comics did it for us. We could be involved in the comics, our imagination, but you grow up and you lose some of that imagination. So the comics that were magical as kids are just kind of fun and cool as an adult. But modern cinema today has reinvented the superhero genre. And it has captured the ability to take 50-year-old people like me, yes, in a couple of weeks, that's my age, and recapture the inspiration of that passion of believing in superheroes. A couple of years ago, they redid Superman and they called it Man of Steel. And in the movie, there is a scene that I almost wept at. They capture the moment that Superman first flies. The first half of the movie, he's just Clark Kent, and he's discovering who he is, and his earthly father is telling him, don't display your powers, the world will think of you as odd, the world will ostracize you, don't, keep it under wraps, but then his father passes away, and so he ends up at the Fortress of Solitude, and if you're not a Superman fan, you're just going to have to let that one go. The rest of you know what that is. He goes to the Fortress of Solitude, and there he hears the voice of his father from his home planet who tells him, yes, take this suit, the powers that you can know, the way you will inspire people, the way that you will rise above the problems and the conflicts and help in the midst of it. And it captures this moment. Well, why don't you watch rather than me describing it to you?
So different from them. Earth's sun is younger and brighter than Krypton's was. Your cells have drunk in its radiation, strengthening your muscles, your skin, your senses. Earth's gravity is weaker, yet its atmosphere is more nourishing. You've grown stronger here than I ever could have imagined. The only way to know how strong is to keep testing your limits.
is why a 4-year-old puts his hands out. That is why, because as a kid, we want to believe that there is such a thing as rising above the gravity, rising above the circumstances, having the strength to overcome everything. But we become adults and we let the things of the earth pound us, and the situations and the grief and the depression and the mundane and the ordinary, and we lose the ability to think or to dream along those lines. And no, I'm not about to suggest that Superman's real, although UFOs are. I would suggest to you that Paul wants to recapture your imagination about the superhero that is God. On Father's Day, yes, it's great to think of God as a good, good father, but I'm going to challenge you this morning to think of him as the powerful superhero that gives grace into your life. Listen to how Paul finishes the passage. Romans chapter 8. What then shall we say about these things? If God's for us, who can be against us? Who's going to separate us from the love of Christ? Trouble? Stress? Persecution? Famine? Nakedness? Danger? The sword? No. In all these things, we have complete victory through him who loved us. I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor heavenly rulers, nor things that are present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation could ever, ever, ever separate us from the love of Christ and Christ Jesus our Lord. His grace in your life, he knows what he's doing. And it doesn't matter what takes place, earthly circumstances. Paul says that if you have come into relationship with him, if you have said yes to him, then his grace in your life, it sets the course. It provides the counsel through his Spirit, and it arranges all the circumstances, and nothing can detour what he wants to do because it is contingent upon his grace, not your abilities. How amazing is God's grace? It is amazing. Beyond just, I got a better job. So let me ask you this morning, does God know you? Not do you go to church, but have you surrendered to him? Have you come to understand the plan that he has for you? And if so, are you listening to his Spirit to know what the next step is? And as you go through life and you experience grief or pain, are you allowing his power to rise you above and to lift you and let you fly, understanding that what we are going to ultimately know means that what is happening here cannot be compared? Allow his grace this morning to present to you the truth of what it means for him to know you.